Greetings. It's Thursday, and I just wanted to take a few minutes to review one of my favorite albums that I've ever listened to, and it is Derek and the Dominos Live in Concert. Can you see that? That's Derek and the Dominos Live in Concert. Um, I actually have owned this album a couple times. I wish I had the original one. As usual, I loaned it out to someone years ago. That was the story back in those days, and it's one of the ones I never seemed to get back, but I did buy it over the internet, so I've got an original vinyl copy. Derek and the Dominoes. um, First of all, let me just say it's a really cool sort of, you get a historic feel when you look at it. It's the old live album, great picture of Clapton, in the heyday of his rock star glory there, playing that Brownie Strat. Um, I know you're not going to get that on a CD, let me tell you that. Look at that great photograph. We all wish we were that cool, don't we? I surely do. Eric Clapton or Clint Eastwood. We all wish we were that awesome. And it's got some information on the back. Looking back on it, this album was never, really one of the big live albums. I mean, I guess if you think of the really important live albums, you probably imagine Deep Purple, Made in Japan, Kiss, Alive, Bob Seger, Live Bullet, particularly if you're from Detroit. Where Peter Frampton, Comes Alive. Obviously, you've got a lot of really iconic live albums, and then a lot of bands back in those days would just release live albums, and some of them kind of went into the, they were kind of collector's items. Even back then, they weren't necessarily things that you were going to hear on the radio, but they were great. It was great to hear an artist or a band perform their best songs in concert. And I always thought that was this album. It's I don't know if I've much, maybe a time or two at midnight or something, driving home a late night. But I've really now Clapton did do some pretty good live albums. Just One Night, he had a good live album or two in the late '70s, early '80s that you would hear quite a bit. And Cream, of course, Crossroads, the live version you always hear. But Derek and the Dominoes, of course, part of that might be that they were a short-lived band. This Derek and the Dominoes came out in 1970. The album Layla and Other Assorted Love Songs, and this album was released right after that. I don't know the exact date. I guess I could Google it. But of course, one of the big regrets is that Duane Allman's not on this record. Duane Allman had passed away by that time. So, um, but you have Bobby Whitlock, Carl Rattle, um, Jim Gordon, and so it's a great four-piece unit. Um, and it's a band that didn't last that long, and it would be, the studio album that's you always hear. Particularly these days you mostly hear Layla, but if you're a Clapton fan, you know a lot of the great Derek and the Domino songs. I Looked Away, of course. Bell Bottom Blues you still hear occasionally, not really that much. But the studio album was basically, as far as I'm concerned, kind of a live album. I'm sure they did overdubbing, but I think they left the tape rolling. Tommy Dow just left the tape rolling, so you have great jams, with Key to the Highway, I Looked Away, Bell Bottom Blues, Any Day, Nobody Knows You When You're Down and Out. Some people say I Am Yours isn't the most popular one, that kind of acousticy Hawaiian sound one. But Keep On Growing, Tell the Truth. I mean, what a great album. And a lot those were such jams. Plus, you had Duane Allman. So, in some ways, you might say, well, what really could a live album offer to a listener? I mean, it was great to hear a live album of a studio band that was really polished, and then you'd hear them in concert really extend their songs, or just, and even sometimes, to hear the occasional, squeaks and cracks and groans in the audience and so on. That was, you kind of would imagine you were there. And Of course, when I look at this album, it just takes me back to my youth. What a great record. But let's talk a little bit about some of the songs on here. I think it's, again, you can see there's the album. Um, and I think every one of these songs, even if you're a Derek and the Dominoes fan, you probably have heard much more the studio version. Some of these have been also done on later albums, like Have You Ever Loved a Woman, or the Stevie Winwood Rainbow Concert, that was done with Pete Townsend when Eric Clapton was coming out of his sort of wilderness period out of heroin addiction. But uh, but let's talk a little bit. The album, of course, is a traditional double album, so with sides on it. So we'll kind of go. I still think in vinyl. You'll have to forgive me. But we've got "Why Does Love Gotta Be So Sad?" It's a great opener. What a great song. That's a Clapton and Bobby Whitlock song. By the way, Bobby Whitlock is I don't want to say an unsung hero. Obviously, people love him, and but he just really shines on this record, and it is a band effort. It's not just a Eric Clapton solo record. And I think Eric Clapton will be the first one to say that it was a band. And Bobby Whitlock was an absolute critical part. He co-wrote several of the most important songs on that album, including Bell Bottom Blues. By the way, I saw him in Atlanta a few years ago, and he remarked that originally Bell Bottom Blues was not listed as a Clapton Whitlock collaboration, but he kind of pointed that out there at Clapton, and one day he got a phone call from Mr. Clapton that acknowledged Bobby's contribution to the song, so that was great. But you've got just several great songs on here, and now the studio album is great. That was recorded in Miami. So, but what's interesting, I guess in some ways, some might say it detracts, because obviously on the studio album you've got Eric Clapton and Duane Allman. I mean, how you're not going to improve on that. You might be able to plug in someone, two different great guitarists, but you're not going to get anybody better than Eric Clapton and Duane Allman. And they both have these. Duane Allman, of course, tragically cut short in his life, but the bulk of his catalog was the Allman Brothers, and Clapton's done so many things, but they came together for that just one shining album, which immediately becomes one of the all-time rock albums ever made. So that tells you something. And on this, unfortunately, we don't have Duane Allman. So what that does do, I guess, if there's a silver lining to that, is you really get a chance to hear Eric Clapton just with a band. It's not really raw like in the sense that Cream is. Cream is just a three-piece, a classic power trio. But with this, you actually get a chance to hear Eric Clapton, and it's just his guitar. So there's a keyboard, bass, drums, guitar. There's no, I don't know if maybe they cleaned it up a little bit, but there's really not any overdubbing or anything. It's just one solo guitar. And it starts out with "Why Does Love Gotta Be So Sad?" Super good solo in A minor. Just a classic. Clapton burning it up. And it's more extended. Now it's pretty extended on the studio album. The studio album was back in the days when people didn't mind a 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 minute song, but we've got these go even longer. Um, Got to Get Better in a Little While. That's a great song that was not on the actual Derek and the Dominoes record. I don't know if that was. I'd have to double check. Some of you can maybe correct me. I don't know if Got to Get Better in a Little While was maybe done with that period when he was playing with Dave Mason and some of those guys. I think Delaney and Bonnie. But anyway, there's a pretty good version of it on here. Um, it's got "Let It Rain" on it, which is from the first Eric Clapton solo album, um, which is actually co-written by Bonnie Bramlett, and that's such a great song. I think in retrospect, a lot of those probably he could do better now. Not only maybe as a more seasoned player, he's even in his 70s, but I mean, certainly the more seasoned Eric Clapton could maybe do them better now. When you think about it, and I'm older now, so when you think about it, he was just a kid when he did these albums. He was, 25, 26, 27, I mean, gosh, um, so plus the production is so much more sophisticated now, and the discipline that people bring to producing records. But "Let It Rain" obviously is a great song, and the studio album, it's got the great sort of iconic Strat solo at the end. But I would put this one up against the studio version. It's got a big, long, great guitar solo with the concert feel that you kind of don't get in the first Eric Clapton solo album. You can just, there's something about playing in a concert when you're in those big old stadiums cranked so loud, and that you could just hear the echo and the ambience of the guitar so well. "Let It Rain" does have a pretty long guitar drum solo and a big traditional, everybody's feeling pretty good long drum solo, and it's a great drum solo, I'm sure. I don't know. I've always found big, long, sort of late 60s, early 70s drum solos kind of an acquired taste. I remember I saw the Grateful Dead, and they had maybe a 20, 30-minute drum solo with two drums, and I'm sure it was great drumming, but I wasn't quite sure if people were clapping when it was over because it was over, or because because it was so good. But anyway, it does have a big long drum solo in it, which is something. And then it's got a very nice version of "Presence of the Lord," the version with which I believe was sung by Stevie Winwood on the Blind Faith record, and this has a really good version of "Presence of the Lord." Side three has a great version of "Tell the Truth." That super good song that opens up side three on the studio album. And again, that's a Bobby Whitlock Clapton compilation. It's kind of pared down here. You don't have the Dwayne Allman slide screaming in there, but it's got some good licks in it for sure, and great organ from Mr. Whitlock. And then "Bottle of Red Wine." Now, "Bottle of Red Wine" is one of my favorite Eric Clapton songs. It's just a good kind of rock and roll. It's got a 50s feel to it. It's in the key of C, and it's got a great guitar solo in the studio version. That's on the first solo album. And this one, in my opinion, "Bottle of Red Wine" has some of the nicest guitar playing on this record. It's just it's more extended now than the studio. The studio version is a very clean, disciplined, runs right through the song with a good pass through the verses, a solo. But here you've got an extended solo, but it's still got that kind of discipline, all those nice kind of key of C riffs that are kind of melodic, but also incorporate blues riffs, and but it's in my opinion that some of the best Clapton guitar playing, not only on this record, but really it's right up there with some of his best stuff that people would cite "Badge" and so on. Side four has another great song that you don't hear too much. I think this was kind of one like uh, uh, got to get better in a little while. It was maybe even less so. It was not done. They didn't. It wasn't on the studio album, but there's a really good version of it on here, and there's also a good version of it, I think, on the Eric Clapton's Rainbow concert with Stevie Winwood and Pete Townsend. But it's "Roll It Over," kind of a good song. I think it might be about what, but "Roll It Over." It's got a good kind of. It's got a little bit of wah wah in it, I think, but a good old bar room kind of, just a touch sleazy, but it's good guitar playing. Then you've got "Blues Power," which was a great song. Another song where he really shines on some of the great guitar playing on "Blues Power." And of course, the ending is "Have You Ever Loved a Woman?" One of the sort of really iconic guitar songs. That's a good example. It's a 12-bar blues in A, I believe. And I mean, I guess you could say there's not much to it, unless, of course, you happen to play guitar like Eric Clapton, in which case it becomes, a classic. But just hats off to this album, particularly Bobby Whitlock. I'm a big Bobby Whitlock fan, and I did see him and he signed my Bobby Whitlock or my Derek and the Domin or Delaney and Bonnie live featuring Eric Clapton record, and told me that was Bob Dylan's feet on the cover and everything. And he and his wife have a great duo, and really did a good job. But this is a good album. I would recommend it. Like I said, there are more iconic. This was kind of one of those, you know, in the bins concert records that they used to make. So many, practically every band would have a good concert record back in those days. A lot of them went on to become radio staples, and a lot of them didn't, you know. But to me, they were always interesting because you really got to hear the band in a kind of organic, authentic way that sometimes you didn't hear on the studio album. I would not say that's the case with Derek and the Dominoes, because Derek and the Dominoes played super good uh, live stuff, practically live in the studio. I'm sure they recorded so much stuff, and just I think Tommy Dowd even said, like, Key to the Highway, you can hear it. Some of those they were just recording and just everything pretty much, and they just at the end of it all they took the best stuff. But this is a really good album. I think it doesn't have the, you know, a lot of you know, it's not all dialed up with production or anything. It's pretty much just for good players with good songs. Um, and one of rock's most important bands, which unfortunately only lasted for a short time, but definitely a really good album. I recommend it. And if you can, if you can find a vinyl copy, it's worth having. You know, I'm sure all these are on YouTube even now. I don't know what the legalities of that are, but it's really worth having. That picture is so nice, Eric Clapton. And so Derek and the Dominoes live. By the way, I'm gonna be doing more little videos. I've had some of my own songs up on the internet, but I'm gonna start doing my own videos which talk about album reviews and uh, discussions. I'm gonna start doing gear reviews. I see all these other. I've become a fan of all these different guitar sites, and you know I play guitar, know a little bit about music myself. So when I can, I'm gonna upload some gear reviews and album reviews, discussions, and so on. Maybe get some other people involved as well. But anyway, Derek and the Dominoes live at I think Fillmore East. And by the way, Bobby Whitlock's on Facebook sometimes, so he might weigh in and correct me or add elements or even. But only I would only say that you know, I have 100% respect for the band and what they did, and wish they had stuck around longer, because like so many people from that period, their best music would didn't, you know, maybe they never got to make because they were only together for a little while. But I think um, their studio album speaks for itself. You know, I just watched you know, John Heaton, yeah, has a good videos. But he talked about his favorite albums, and I think that he had 20. You know, Beatles, Abbey Road, Sticky Fingers by the Stones, and some of the really great albums, and he put that in the top 20, which I would totally agree with. Derek and the Dominoes, Layla and Other Assorted Love Songs is one of the best rock and roll albums ever made, with all its roughness, with all its uh, with all its live feel. You can just hear the great musicianship and the guitars in particular, but everybody's just playing so well. And this is another window into that band. And in some ways, you get a really good feel of how the band had their own sound. You know, they weren't cookie cutter. They had their own Derek and the Dominoes sound. Um, and Eric Clapton, Bobby Whitlock, Jim Gordon, and Carl Rattle. I believe Carl Rattle passed away in the late '70s or so. Don't know the circumstances, but I'm sure it was sad, because he wasn't he shouldn't have died at that age. But what a great band! What and this album, I guess my final thoughts are, it's a product of its time in the good sense. You get, it's not fancy. It's I guess a rock critic might pick apart, think it's too long. you know, Eric Clapton sounds bored. You know, this is right before he took that hiatus, which is kind of infamous. You know, where he kind of almost quit playing for a while. You know, I think I've even read Eric Clapton sounds bored. He's kind of going through the motions. But let me tell you, first of all, I don't think he was bored. But assuming he was bored, uh, he's still playing his ass off on this album, and his fingers work fine. You know, and it's him at the peak. Who he was in the with Derek and the Dominos. He was at the peak. I don't know if I mean Eric Clapton has done some great stuff. He's a good example of how you can season into you know, in some ways keep getting better. You know, but if you know, if you want the young hot stuff, that he's got some great licks on here. Um, and I totally recommend this record. And get the vinyl if you can. Thank you.